Hi everyone. I'm Kelsie Merchant. I am also a student from Holberton, and today I'm going to talk with you all about a code that or a skill that I think is very important to everyone who codes, and that's being able to talk about your code. Being able to explain your code clearly is a very important skill, and so hopefully we'll break down some tips today, so you'll feel like talking about your code is as easy as pie. So first up, why do you want to listen to me talk about talking about code? You might break this down into three main reasons. One, if you're new to tech or you're interested in switching up your career, you might primarily be concerned about talking about your code for what's called a technical interview. During a technical interview, you want to make sure that you're able to clearly explain to the technical interviewer that you understand and know exactly what you're talking about. However, even once you get into a job, you still might be talking about your code. You'll primarily be doing this among your technical peers, doing things like talking about conferences, presenting at conferences, debugging with your peers, trying to figure out what code best practices your company follows, or even just mentoring new people. And third, you might also have non-technical team members, and typically your clients also don't have the same level of technical understanding that you do. So you want to make sure that you're able to talk about your code in a way that everyone can understand. The first thing you want to do is you want to ask yourself one big question, and that's who's your listener, and more specifically, what their background is. In general, sometimes you understand where your listener is coming from and you're able to clearly answer this question. And other times, this might take a little bit more of a thought process for you to think through. As a general rule of thumb, I recommend if you're kind of on the fence of understanding your listener's background, I say that you should err on the side of over explaining. While you don't want to talk down to your listener, typically most people are going to be understanding and will nod along to show that they understand. Whereas if you err on the side of under explaining, you often can leave people feeling confused and flustered, and it's not a good feeling that you want your listener to walk away with. So let's go into some tips to make talking about your code easier. First, I want to recommend starting with why. This is a little bit of a deeper why than we talked about at the beginning. This is what you want you or your listener to get out of this talk. You can kind of think of this as a kind of a coding tagline or intro, and it's going to set the stage for what to expect for both you and your listener. As an example, I've talked about why you might want to start with your why for a pitch versus a debugging session. For a pitch, you really want to keep things high level, and your listener's primarily going to be listening for the user's needs. This can be something like today our pie specials are pecan, key lime, and blueberry. Whereas if you're in a debugging session, this tends to be a lot more detailed, sometimes almost even line by line through your code. And you're going to be asking your listener to listen more attentively and think more critically as you're going through your talk. This can be something like, I'm not quite sure why the crust didn't turn out right. I use melted butter, and you would keep listing through your ingredients. And it gives your user an opportunity to tell you that cold butter actually works better when baking a crust. My next tip is to make it relatable. You can use analogies, but the important thing is that you're finding ways to tie it back to everyday life or something that your audience already understands. Anybody at Holberton knows that I love talking about Quicksort, which is a sorting algorithm. So Wikipedia defines Quicksort as an efficient sorting algorithm. It's a divide and conquer algorithm that uses a select pivot from an array and partitions other elements in that array into two subarrays, according to whether they are less than or greater than the pivot. For this reason, it's sometimes called a partition exchange sort, and those subarrays are then sorted recursively. This can be done in place, requiring small additional amounts of memory to perform the sorting. If you're anything like me, this explanation might cause your eyes to kind of glaze over. To me, it's not a very clear understanding of what Quicksort is. So to break this down in a way that's a little bit more intuitive, I like to think of Quicksort like laundry. So whenever we're going through laundry, we typically make these quick decisions to sort things into piles. And this is exactly what Quicksort is doing, only instead of piles, it's using subarrays or sublists. So it's making quick decisions like, can this sock be bleached? or should it go in a non-bleached wash? And you're able to quickly kind of make these decisions and sort things into piles. Now, it's important to note here, the piles themselves aren't necessarily sorted, but you know each pile has certain characteristics. For example, everything on the left is a white sock, and everything on the right should be washed without using bleach. You can then keep doing the same kind of pattern and break things up. For example, if you wanted to separate your darker socks from your kids' colorful socks. And that's exactly what Quicksort does. You take a pivot and you sort things quickly into two different sides. So on the left, you can see that everything on the left is now less than what was originally our pivot, and everything on the right is greater than or equal to our pivot. And you just keep doing this on subarrays, choosing new pivots, breaking things down, until you end up with only one element and then you know that you're guaranteed to have a completely sorted array. Walking through this way by giving it an analogy that makes sense with what goes on in our day-to-day lives makes Quicksort a lot more relatable and understandable than reading some confusing definition, even if it's on the internet. My next tip is not to just read ingredients. So what I mean by this is I feel like a lot of times when we first start talking about our code, we're tempted to read through our code. But reading through our code line by line, like for I equals 0, array at I not equal to null byte, and I less than n, is about as effective as just reading through an ingredients list. Half a cup of sugar, half a cup packed brown sugar, 3 tablespoons all-purpose flour. And even though you might be talking with fellow coders or fellow bakers, what you're lacking there is kind of the story that goes along with your code. And so even though people may have wrote a similar code before or may have baked a similar pie, by missing those kind of linking segments, it can take a while for your listener to really follow in and understand what you're talking about. So instead, I like to think of talking about your code like a story. So for example, in this function, we are writing a function that's going to print a given character array, character by character, up to n number of characters, or if n is greater than the length of our array, we're just going to go ahead and print out the full array. So then when we go into our code, instead of just reading things out word for word, you can kind of keep going back to that story. So for example, in this case, we have an index value that's storing where we're at in the array. We're going to start it at the beginning, and then we're going to loop through the array character by character until we reach an endpoint where we've gotten to the end of the array, which is indicated by the null byte, or we've reached n, which is the maximum number of characters that we want to print. And talking through it this way kind of helps your user or your listener follow along and really understand why you're doing each step instead of just reading those steps word for word. And next, I want to suggest that you practice talking about your code. While we don't always get a chance to practice talking about your code, I like to kind of think of this as something that's similar that happens on the Great British Baking Show. So for anybody that's watched the show, I've recently been watching this on Netflix. It's a lot of fun. There are 3 challenges that the competitors go through. The first is a signature bake, then they go into a technical bake and a showstopper bake. The signature bake and the showstopper bake, they actually get to practice and test out with their family and friends all week before they actually rebake that over the weekend and present it to the judges. Talking about your code is kind of like this. Like I said, sometimes you don't always get a chance to practice. Sometimes it's like that technical challenge and you just got to jump in and talk about your code. But other times you will have time to practice with your friends and family before you start talking about your code with somebody new. This can be a great opportunity for you to get feedback and listen to what's unclear from your friends and family before you present it to a client or your boss. And last, I also want to recommend that just talking about your code is going to give you practice. So even if you don't get a chance to practice the first time, being able to talk about your code on a regular basis will give you kind of that muscle memory and more practice for the third or fourth time that you talk about your code. So, in conclusion, I want to make sure that you understand 3 reasons why you should be talking about your code and start incorporating this today if you aren't already. I want you to make sure that you're asking yourself one big question, and that's who is your listener? And then have 4 tips. Start with your why, make it relatable, don't just read the ingredients, and practice. And then hopefully talking about your code will be as simple as 3.14 or pi. Thanks.